in this section, we are going to combine the localized electron model and the molecular orbital theory, which is a little bit of, may sound like a contradiction because we were like trying to move away from localized thinking to delocalized thinking. But as we often do with models, we just use them according to the context and according to the needs that we have for a specific problem or situation. And we will see what I mean by that by using the resonance example. So here we have NO3, and we have three possible resonance structures. If we look carefully, we'll see that the sequence of the atoms, that is the arrangement of the atoms, is the same for the three structures, and also the number of electrons is the same for the three structures, and where the electrons are is the same for the three structures, except in the case of the double bond. So what we're moving around from one structure to the other is that double bond. And we remember that a double bond is formed by one sigma bond and one pi bond. And when we say that the difference is where the double bond is localized, what we actually mean is that the place where we are drawing that pi bond differs from one structure to the other. So we're moving that pi bond around. And that leads us to this idea of just thinking of the sigma bonds in a molecule as localized, which means we're going to use the localized electron model for the sigma bonds and think of the pi bonds as not localized, which means we're going to use the molecular orbital theory for them. And that makes sense because sigma bonds are, we say, in between the two nuclei. The electrons are in that internuclear distance, in that axis. So we can think of them as being localized there. Now, one of the questions we have is, would there be a better way to represent delocalization instead of using like three full structures? Just find a way to condense that. And the answer is obviously yes. And to show you how we do that, we're going to use benzene as an example. So benzene is a molecule that of the type that we call cyclic. It's a cycle. It has 6 carbons, and this type of representation we have here, we call it topological, and wherever 2 lines meet, we're going to have a carbon. So for each one of these structures, we have a cycle, and that cycle has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons, and each carbon is attached to one hydrogen, and each carbon is attached to 2 other carbons. So if we count the number of electron groups or electron domains around each carbon, we'll see that it will be 3. Each carbon has 3 electron domains around it, which means that using our localized thinking, we can say that each carbon is hybridized sp2 because it has those 3 electron domains. And that also means that each carbon has one unhybridized p orbital. Each carbon has one p orbital that is not being used for hybridization. The sp, as we see in the figure in color, the sp2 orbitals will be used to form sigma bonds between each carbon and one hydrogen, and that same carbon and 2 other carbons. And remember, sigma bonds are bonds that are located along the internuclear axis. So this drawing here nicely shows that each carbon has 3 bonds for which it is using the sp2 orbitals, hybridized orbitals. As we said, each carbon has one p orbital that is not hybridized, and that one p orbital, since it is a p orbital, is bilobular. It has two lobes, one above the plane of the molecule and one below the plane of the molecule. And those orbitals, p orbitals from adjacent atoms, can overlap. We don't show here the actual size of the p orbitals because that would be too crowded. So we thin them a little bit, but they are thick enough so that they overlap with the p orbitals of adjacent carbons, and they form this kind of ring, a ring above and below the plane of the molecule. And the electrons that reside in those orbitals, those p orbitals, can move around that ring through the entire collection of 6 carbon atoms. And that's why we say that they are delocalized. And to represent that more easily, what we do, that would correspond to the bottom drawing or the bottom image. We just have the 6 carbons and we draw a circle within that hexagon. And that circle means that the electrons are delocalized, that we have 3 pi bonds that are delocalized. There will be a total of 6 electrons that are localized, that belong to the 6 atoms altogether. And that's 6 because each one of these p orbitals has 1 p electron. Good. And the very last aspect that we will discuss in this chapter, which I really like that this book mentions this idea, is the idea of models, and how orbitals are just plain models. They do not exist as a physical reality. And the reason I say that I find this nice that the book touches upon this idea is because if we don't understand how models work, we have a harder time understanding science, the concepts of science. So what I've got here is a definition, one of the many definitions you can find for model. And I think that one thing that has been limiting under our understanding, conceptual understanding, is that we have been thinking of models just as visuals, just as drawings or images. Models are not just that. The most relevant definition or understanding of models that we have for our purposes, well, there are 2 or 3. For our purposes would be a model like a mathematical description. So we can model a part of reality utilizing like mathematical equations. Like when you draw a line, you are modeling, for instance, the constant speed motion of an object. So you have a straight line, you have y equals m times x plus b. That's a model. Or we use models, you use models in the lab when you use statistics, for instance. And the other aspect of models that I want to emphasize is the conceptual idea of models. When you have a conceptual model, you don't have a drawing. A conceptual model can be just simply an explanation of how things work. And we can do that for the atom, for instance. We can describe how the atom is structured, and that would be our model. We have external and internal models. The internal models, we cannot access them. They reside in our brains, in our minds, and we utilize them. The more sophisticated models that we create in our minds, in our heads, the more sophisticated the kind of thinking that we can do. If we have rudimentary models, if we just learn to develop rudimentary models, our thinking will be rudimentary as well. And that's why I insist it is very important that we understand how models work. So we have these conceptual models. The Aufbau principle, for instance, is a conceptual model. And there's reasoning behind it that explains why the orbitals in atoms or molecular orbitals fill up the way that they do. So do not think of models just as pictures or miniature um, models of a larger object. And there's another, I said that we used to work through different types of models. The other type of model that you may have been exposed to is in biology, when you can take an ecosystem or a biology, or you can take an animal, you can take a rat in the lab and model the impact of a certain drug in mammals by using what happens to that rat or mouse or whatever, okay? So we can use an entire organism to model biological responses. Just keep this broad idea of model and do not think of model as a drawing, a picture, or a miniature representation of a larger object. And with that, we finish this chapter, and we've got some step and practice. All I'm gonna ask you all to do for now will be to complete the molecular orbitals for cyanide, Cn minus, and answer the question that we have here. Is this an ion paramagnetic? Is it isoelectronic with NO plus? And what's the bond order? And a question I found very interesting, if it is isoelectronic with NO plus, does that mean that they will have the same reactivity? And again, keep reminding yourselves why we're learning what we're learning. We're trying to establish these relationships between structure and reactivity. That's the whole point of this class. And with this, we've finished chapter 14. No, probably we don't, but we finished this video.